Were you at the time able to apply for Fulbright in Russia?
No. So I applied to study the national question, and I didn't even make it out of the Oakland competition. I had a bit of a reputation because of my earlier, and but in doing my research, I learned about a program that was run from McAllister College, where Kofi Annan, Hubert Humphrey went there, in St. Paul, Minnesota, ran in Zagreb to study Russian for a year. So I went to that program. And we had one program to study in Leningrad, but my Russian wasn't nearly, you really needed to have good Russian. There were mainly graduate students on that program. So I went, they just demanded you be healthy to go to this program essentially and have a little bit of Russian. I got in, and I spent a year in Zagreb studying Russian, but also being interested in history. I listened to lectures from really great historians from the Zagreb philosophy faculty, Mirjana Gross, Jaroslav Šidak, and Ljubo Boban, who were all sort of major figures, not just in Yugoslavia, but globally. They were well known. And
How was Yugoslavia in the 70s?
it was, it was so much different than now studying abroad. I didn't speak to my parents for a year. I wrote 2 letters a week. They wrote me 2 letters a week. I asked my parents to cut out, the comic strip Doonesbury. Do they still have? At the time, there was this. My mother cut out Doonesbury every day and sent it to me, and send it, like once a month would send me Doonesbury.
How long would it take to receive a letter?
A week, 10 days. No, not too bad. If you wanted to call home, you had to go to the post office. It was quite expensive. And so I never did. We just wrote all the time. And it was a well-functioning state. This was, you go back having then studied very carefully. This was the period of what they say in Croatian, the Hrvatsko šutnja. Everything was after the 1971, the purges, and everything was really quiet. So politically, there wasn't anything going on. I studied really hard that year. Because I wanted to go to graduate school, and I really wanted to already know my Russian. So I studied really hard in Russian, and I worked really hard to learn Croatian, or there's a Croatian English or Serbian, as they called it there in Zagreb.
How long did you stay?
A year. A little like 10 months. I came in September, and I left at the end of July.
How were your days there? What did you do? How was life?
I ate a burek every day. I had a burek sa sirom, as they said, every day. Mjeth, every day. Mjeth, And I would go to the faculty, I'd take my classes. I had a girlfriend, and thanks to her, and she spoke English quite well, but I didn't know that for the first couple of months. She only spoke Croatian with me, and she was the demonstrator for Šidak, who was like the senior, the senior guy. Šidak was already an old man, great lecturer. And so this is what Yugoslavia was like at the time. I met a guy who was a jazz critic, and I was really into jazz, and so we really hit it off. And so a few weeks, he said, "Listen, I'm going to the Belgrade Jazz Festival. You should come." And so I went, and I skipped a week of class, and they thought that I was going to become there had been a guy the year before that basically just used Zagreb as a, departure point to travel. And so I went for a week to Belgrade, and I was hanging out with all the jazz critics, going backstage, going to all the press conferences, and they were interviewing, and they had great musicians. Charles Mingus was there. Yeah, they had really, it was great. And then there was a Russian jazz piano player named Igor Bril, who was brilliant, an avant-garde. He was fantastic. And so I went to all the press conferences, and the critics, they were all kind of students of sociology and stuff, and they asked these long questions about culture, and these musicians, most of whom, they were articulate, but they couldn't understand or anything like that, and they were just at a different level. They were not, and so it was being televised by Yugoslav television, and
The press conference.
not the press conference, the concerts. Yeah, the concerts they were broadcast by Yugoslav television, and they wanted someone to interview the musicians for like a minute and a half or so when they came off the stage, and they just said, we need someone who they can understand. So they turned to me, and so I interviewed all of these jazz musicians when they came off the stage, the Belgrade Jazz Festival in 1975. And I remember, I won't tell one story. There was a Finnish jazz piano player who I didn't like, and so the question I asked him, I will say this, the question I said, some people say that white people really shouldn't be playing jazz. What do you think? And he gave a great answer. He really did. He gave a great answer. And then when Mingus came off, and I'd already talked to Mingus, because Mingus was one of my heroes, and I told him how much he meant to me, and he just sat there. He was a really totally weird guy, Mingus. He just sat there. Then when he came off stage, it was, what a fantastic set with his long time. I said, Mr. Mingus, what is your message to the people of Yugoslavia? And then he looked and he laughed and he said, get rich. And so it was, so that's what Yugoslavia was like. It was kind of like, I met later, many years later, the Belgrade film director, Srđan Karanović, who was a great director. And what Gija said to us, he says, we used to just say, ajde da napravimo sranja, let's just put some bullshit together, right? Let's just throw it all together. And so there was this great improvisatory quality. And so to the extent that you were not threatening anyone in power and stuff, there's a lot of things that you could do. And that's what I found.
This was 1965?
75. Yeah, 65, it would have been a little too early for that. 65 would have been a little too early for that. Yeah, 75. And so I had an absolutely fantastic time. And then I kept coming back. And so I went to graduate school, and there were these opportunities for IREX. IREX was now IREX has all these projects, development projects all over, but at the time, what IREX did was they handled most of the exchanges with communist countries, at least in Eastern Europe. And so there was an IREX program to spend a month in Bulgaria for Čužestvani Bulgaristi, to study Bulgarian. So I went, and I just thought it's a way. I couldn't afford to go to Yugoslavia or anything. So they paid my way, and I had always traveled through Zagreb, and I did that 1 year. Then I went back and did my. And then when you come,
in the grad school,
so I started off in a multidisciplinary Soviet East European program, and I wanted to go to history, but there were very few jobs in history. The job market in history has been bad since like 1960, I think, and so I took a class from a political scientist, and he said you should, do political science instead. And so I chose political science, and so I then did that, and then I was ghettoized as this kind of communist because our methods and stuff were different. Because at University of Michigan, a very quantitative, positivistic school, and so that a lot of survey research. The Michigan department was a great department, but it's known for its electoral studies, which is done with all the surveys. So you couldn't do any of that in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. So I began studying the national question, issues of the national question. And the approach that I took was one that didn't look at how does nationality affect behavior, but it was how does the state shape nationality? And so that I wrote this long paper looking at comparing Macedonians to Muslims at the time, Muslimani, and later the Bosniaks. And my argument was that actually in socialist Yugoslavia, which is a very clearly non-nationalist, they have helped to shape, for really rational reasons, the development of these national communities. And in many ways they did, in Macedonian clearly, and in the Muslims as well. Because the Muslims did not, when they were in the 53, they didn't declare themselves as Yugoslavs, Serbs, or Croats. They said that they were other. And then it was over time they were allowed to declare themselves as Muslimani, and then you had this elite that emerged, et cetera, et cetera. And so then my advisor said, well, and this must have been in 1979, he said, so why don't you do Kosovo?
Really?
Yeah, he said, so why don't you look at, he said, this is all really interesting, why don't you do Kosovo? So I wrote a paper.
Did you know where that was?
Yeah, of course, I'd been in Yugoslavia,
Okay, were you traveling while you were here? I mean, you mentioned Belgrade, but were you going around?
In 75, I went to Bosnia. I spent time in Slovenia, of course. I never made it to Macedonia. I didn't get that far down. And Belgrade, and then time on the coast. And of course, but yeah, it was nice. But I preferred Korčula to Dubrovnik. Actually, it was much nicer, in a lot of ways. And yeah, I didn't go to Istria. It was only in '82 when I was back doing my doctoral research that I spent time. That's when I went everywhere. I always say, I went to every republic and autonomous province in Yugoslavia. But that was after I wrote my piece. So I wrote a piece about, because in doing my work, my undergraduate thesis was about the development of Croatian nationalism until 1848. So I wrote all about the Illyrian movement and all this kind of stuff. And then there was an article, who wrote, I can't remember the guy, a volume edited by Peter Sugar from University of Washington, on the national question in Eastern Europe. And I remember reading the chapter on Yugoslavia, and it was comprehensive. It covered everything. And so I ended up writing, he told me that probably was in 80 or 81, because then I wrote a piece about the demonstrations in 1981. And then it was my first published article, which was published in a journal called Problems of Communism, and published in '83 while I was doing my doctoral research.
We'll return to that, yeah. It's a big topic.
Yeah. And so
So tell me about Kosovo and your mentor said.
So what I did, and at the time, it was pre-internet.
Mm-hmm.
So there were three ways, sources of information, if you wanted something on current events. Because one was Yugoslav newspapers, and we subscribed to all of them at Michigan, but they came like 6 weeks, 8 weeks late. So to read, I don't know if we got Rilindia. So, but we did get, Nin, and we got Vus at the time. I don't think that was before Danas. I think maybe Danas, but it was the Zagreb Weekly. And then, of course, Politika and Borba. Borba was a good source, but a very, with a clear perspective, I would say. Less nationalistic, though, than Politika, as I look back. And then there was this, there are these things called FBIS, Federal Broadcast Information Service, and they would come within 4 or 5 days. And these were translations of the press that were done by the United States government. that were then distributed to everybody. And so we received them. They were rather inexpensive, too much for a graduate student, but my advisor got them, and then we got them in the library as well. And I think the Russian Center also got them. So I had 3 different sources to get them, and so that's where you'd find out what was going on. And so that was the source of information. And Michigan was a great place to do this because there was an anthropologist who had done his work in Bosnia, had done field work in Bosnia, and his wife was a folklorist who had done her work in Bosnia in the 60s in an area near Bugojno. The medieval historian I became really good, John Fine, his wife is from Svetozarevo, or now Jagodina, but she ended up going to Brandeis as an undergrad, and but Gena had lots of contacts, and so that you can, you had a lot of, there was a large kind of Balkan community relatively at Michigan. To do what I did, there was the only other place I would have would have been Berkeley. But later talking to people who went to Berkeley I'm really glad I went to Michigan. I mean, Michigan, everyone got along, the professors all got along pretty well. And, like you've been, there's always places where academic squabbles are huge in the United States that are based on nothing and all this. There was a bit of that between, say, the language literature people and the social scientists, but within history and they didn't involve the graduate students in any of the conflicts. And so for me, it was like being in heaven in a lot of ways.
How was Kosovo depicted at the time through those news that you had access to?
I'll send you my article if you want. But Kosovo was seen as there was a problem of integrating Kosovo into Yugoslavia, and on every level, economically, socially, and culturally and politically. And in the article I wrote, you could see the rise of an ethnically Albanian middle class after the amendments of '68. And you can sort of see the growth of ethnic Albanians working in the social sector, the growth of percentage of party members for ethnic Albanians, and even today when you meet people of the older generation, they all speak Serbian quite fluently, et cetera, and so that they were really part of the system, part of the regime, in many ways. And in Kosovo, similar to Croatia, although more extreme, that there was a lot more opposition, and that there were people. So that you had a lot of political prisoners and stuff like that, and there was that sort of stuff. But I mean, overall, it was just seen as, high birth rate was a problem, and that no matter how much investment went into Kosovo from these federal funds, and how much growth there was, that per capita growth was not so great because of the high birth rate, and so in many ways it was seen as not being fully integrated. And I didn't realize how inaccurate that was, how that was inaccurate until I came here first time in '99. The first time I actually spent time in Kosovo was in '99. Because what I found is that I had friends that studied in Zagreb. You meet all these people that go to study in Sarajevo and in Belgrade and in Skopje, and so that in many ways Kosovo was part of this Yugoslav system. And that it's one thing that if you were, of course, rural, and then you were not necessarily. It was a kind of a dual system in that sense. But people that were urban, and that, in the case of my friend Baskin, I think that my 2 friends that went and studied political science in Zagreb, I don't think their parents were family members. Although one was a brother of Orhan Nevzati. I don't know if you know Orhan. Orhan Nevzati was. He was in the Central Committee with Nikezic in the late '60s, and he was purged when Nikezic was. And then Orhan later, I think he lives in Belgrade now, but he's from Prizren.
Have you met Albanians while you were in Zagreb? In
'89 I did.
In '89.
I met Vevi. There was this guy that owned a restaurant that went from, it was a Chinese restaurant, an Argentine steakhouse, and that was the first time I had Kosovo wine. They had Ordoving, they had wine. I was drinking, and it was great wine, and it was cheap. You know, even during communism, it was less expensive than, you know, Kutjevac or Grašovina, you know, this Croatian wine, and so it's quite good. And so, anyways, I mean, these people were. I mean, so there were many ways in which they were, but you know, there were, of course, in the end, it didn't work, and especially after Tito died, and the lid got off on it and stuff.
Turn to
Yeah.
that 81 article. How difficult was to write something about 81 because not much information was.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Okay.
There was a lot. Really, in the press, it was all there. I'll show you. I mean, I'll send you the
It
article.
was, but like today, you can hardly find an image of a protester, and it was really controlled the way.
Well, my article was not about the people. It was the question I was asking in the article. And the journal was one that was published by the State Department, although it was an academics wrote it. It was, can the regime reestablish some kind of legitimate order? And so it was really looking at what are the prospects for Kosovo. And so, and it was easy to find all about all the demonstrations, Trepča Radi, Belgrad, Gradi, you know, that kind of stuff. And it was easy to find all that sort of stuff. And then you'd read things that were condemning nationalism, but then you'd find information of what was really going on. That when I guess it was Partizan or Zvezda came down and played the Prishtinë football team, everyone was screaming, echo, echo. So, you know, and they were condemning all that, but then you see that really happens. And so that was, so that was what I wasn't doing. You know, the work that What's-Her-Face did, the Norwegian anthropologist in near Pea. You know what I'm talking about? Robert Elsey published that book. It's excellent.